People were shouting in the street. Police stood between two groups. Phones were raised. Cameras were rolling. What looked like a sudden explosion of anger was something much deeper. It was fear, confusion, and shock, all coming out at once. This is not just a story about one protest. It is about what happens when a city changes faster than people expect. Stay with us till the end, because what you are about to hear is not what most headlines explain across the United States. Anti-Muslim protests have begun to appear in places that once seemed calm and settled. These protests are loud, emotional, and often ugly. But if you stop at the shouting, you miss the real story. The real story is not hatred alone. It is power. It is rules. It is who decides how a city is run when its people change. Dearborn, Michigan became the center of national attention when protests broke out in late 2025. By that time, more than half of the city's residents identified as Middle Eastern or North African. It was widely described as the first Muslim-majority city in the country. For some, this was a moment of pride. For others, it felt like the ground had shifted under their feet. What followed was not random anger. It was the surface of a long buildup. What matters is not how many people were in the street. What matters is where the conflict moved. Disagreements that once stayed inside city halls and school meetings spilled into public view. Protest replaced discussion. Confrontation replaced debate. That shift tells us something important. It tells us that trust in local systems was already weak before the shouting began. When people feel heard, they argue inside the rules. When they feel ignored, they argue outside them. To understand why this happened, we have to step back and look at how cities really change. Change does not happen overnight. It builds slowly through families, schools, businesses, and neighborhoods. Over time, numbers turn into votes. Votes turn into council seats. Council seats turn into policy. None of this requires force. It only requires showing up again and again. In Dearborn, many Muslim families had been doing exactly that for decades. They built community groups. They stayed involved in schools. They voted in local elections that most people ignored. For them, this was not a takeover. It was participation. But for longtime residents who had stepped away from local politics, the results felt sudden and shocking. One of the most talked about moments came when the city council voted to limit certain flags on public property. Supporters said the rule was about fairness and neutrality. Critics said it sent a message of exclusion. Both sides believed the process was legal. The real fight was not about the flag itself. It was about what the decision symbolized. Symbols matter because they tell people who belongs. This is where many stories go wrong. They turn this into a fight between religions. But that misses the point. The deeper issue is not Islam. It is what happens when organized groups gain influence while others pull back. Democracy does not reward belief. It rewards effort. The group that shows up shapes the outcome. By 2025, Islam in several American cities was no longer just a private faith. It was also a civic force. Mosques encouraged voting. Community leaders ran for office. Parents organized around school issues. To supporters, this was proof that Muslim Americans were fully part of the system. To critics, it felt like the rules of public life were changing without consent. Schools became one of the first pressure points. Education always carries values, even when people pretend it does not. What children are taught, what is celebrated, and what is avoided all reflect community standards. When organized parents push for limits or changes, decisions that once felt routine become emotional flashpoints. Public space became another battleground. City buildings, events, and permits may seem boring, but they quietly shape culture. When rules change, people read meaning into them. If leaders do not explain decisions clearly, suspicion grows. Silence creates stories, and stories harden into anger. What makes this moment different is that almost everything happened inside the law. Elections were held. Votes were counted. Procedures were followed. That makes simple resistance useless. You cannot protest legality itself. You can only respond with more participation. This is why the word takeover is tempting but misleading. There were no tanks, no threats, no shutdowns. What happened was steady organization meeting low engagement from others. Power did not fall. It was picked up. This pattern is not unique to one city or one country. Similar tensions appeared in parts of Europe where communities changed faster than institutions adapted. In some places, school programs were paused after parent pressure. Supporters called it protection. Critics called it retreat. But again, the deeper story was not belief. It was structure. When one group has numbers and discipline, and others are absent, outcomes follow. Another piece of the story is political realignment. Many people forget that Muslim voters in the United States once leaned conservative on social issues. Family values, small business life, and local community mattered. After national events changed the mood of the country, voting patterns shifted. Over time, this shift moved from national elections into city politics. Local offices matter more than most people realize. City councils decide rules that shape daily life. School boards influence what children see and hear. These roles rarely attract attention until a conflict explodes. By then, the groundwork has already been laid. At the same time, many older civic anchors weakened. Churches closed or moved. Families left cities for suburbs. Volunteer groups faded. Fewer people learned how to take part in local decisions. When these spaces empty out, something else fills them. That is not a conspiracy. It is a vacuum. This is where fear enters. Longtime residents may feel pushed aside even when nothing illegal happened. They feel unfamiliar in their own city. When leaders fail to explain what is changing and why, anger looks for a target. Religion becomes an easy one. Most protests do not begin with hate. They begin with confusion. For many conservative Christians, the concern is not about banning Islam. It is about boundaries. How do different moral views live together in shared spaces? Who decides what is taught to children? How are limits set fairly? When these questions are avoided, resentment grows. Once debate turns into identity conflict, extreme voices get louder. Trust breaks down. Every decision feels personal. Every vote feels like a verdict on belonging. That is when the street replaces the council chamber. There is also a hard truth many cities avoid. Change feels faster when people stop paying attention. When residents disengage from local government, outcomes seem sudden, even if they took years to build. The shock is not the change. It is the moment people finally notice it. History shows that cities can handle deep change without falling apart. But only when rules are clear and applied evenly. Transparency matters. Explanation matters. Leaders who speak plainly matter. If public space belongs to everyone, then standards must apply to everyone. If faith is welcome in public discussion, then no faith can hold a permanent veto. If disagreement is allowed, then intimidation cannot be. When leaders fail to draw these lines, protests become normal. Once that happens, confrontation stops being shocking. It becomes routine. Businesses hesitate. Families withdraw. Schools turn into symbols instead of places to learn. The city turns inward. None of this is destiny. Cities survive change when they treat conflict as something to manage, not something to hide. They invest in civic knowledge. They reward participation across lines. They keep arguments inside institutions instead of pushing them into the street. The real danger is not demographic change. The danger is when people stop believing the system belongs to them. When trust collapses, every rule looks suspicious. Every compromise looks like surrender. Dearborn is not a prophecy. It is a warning. It shows what happens when power shifts faster than explanation. When silence replaces leadership, when people wake up only after the crisis is on camera, the future of American cities will not be decided by charts or slogans. It will be decided by whether local democracy can absorb change without losing legitimacy. Whether councils remain places of debate instead of stages for anger, whether schools remain places of learning instead of symbols of victory, this moment is not about one religion. It is about how shared life works when expectations break. Cities that choose clarity over comfort can calm tensions. Cities that avoid hard conversations invite eruptions. The question is not whether Islam is gaining influence in some cities. The question is whether democracy at the local level can handle that influence without breaking trust. If it can, change will be hard but manageable. If it cannot, the street will keep filling the gap. If you want to understand where this is heading and why it matters far beyond one city, stay engaged. Share your thoughts, join the discussion, and support serious conversations about how communities live together when the world around them changes.